I've never been one to believe in strange stories, but something happened to me last winter that made me question everything. I was returning from a long work trip, driving on an isolated road covered in snow. It was the kind of place that seemed to exist in the middle of nowhere, where the white of the snow swallowed everything around. It was already past 8 at night, and I was exhausted, but I had to keep going because there were no inns or hotels nearby. I remember thinking the road felt eerily empty, not a single soul around except for me. But then out of nowhere, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road right on the right lane. I slammed on the brakes, almost skidding. My first thought was that the person needed help. Who else would be in the middle of a frozen road at that hour? As I got closer, I saw it was a man. He was standing still, wearing a thick black coat, but he had nothing else with him. No suitcase, no backpack, nothing. His face was strange. Not in an obvious way, but something about it made me uncomfortable, as if his gaze was empty, but at the same time too intense. I rolled down the window and asked if he needed help. He simply replied emotionlessly, "A ride." Against my better judgment, I let him in. That's when everything started to go wrong. As soon as he got in the car, a heavy silence filled the air. I tried making small talk, but he answered briefly, as if conserving words. I asked where he was headed, and he said something like, "Just keep going," without specifying a destination. That unsettled me, but I thought maybe he was confused or even in shock from the extreme cold. As I drove, I noticed something strange. Despite the car heater being on, the air felt far too cold, as if the outside chill was seeping in. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that the man was motionless, staring directly at the car dashboard. He didn't look away or even blink. It was unsettling. As we drove on, the road began to change. First, it was the snow. It no longer fell naturally, but seemed to be thrown against the windshield like a hand-drawn storm. The trees lining the road looked bizarre, almost distorted, as if they were shadows of trees, not real ones. I glanced at the man, and he was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile, just his lips curved in an unnatural, emotionless way. My heart started racing, and I tried to hide my nervousness, asking again where he wanted to go. This time he answered in a firmer tone, "You already know where." What did he mean by, "You already know where"? That sentence echoed in my mind as I drove. I tried not to show my growing panic, but I was starting to feel suffocated. For some reason, it felt like his presence in the car was draining the air. When I looked at the road again, I noticed the headlights weren't shining as brightly as before, even as the snow grew thicker. It felt like we were entering some kind of fog, but it wasn't normal. It was as if the air itself was becoming opaque, dense, almost impossible to penetrate. I thought about stopping the car, but something told me that would be worse. That's when he started speaking. It wasn't a conversation, nor an explanation. He just began describing things about me that no one should know. He mentioned the accident I had years ago when I slipped on a road similar to this one and almost lost my life. He talked about how, ever since then, I've always been tense driving in the snow. I had no idea how he knew that. My first instinct was to ask who he was, but my mouth wouldn't move. It was as if my own voice was frozen inside me. As he spoke, the sound seemed to change. It wasn't coming from him, but from somewhere around me, as if it were inside my head. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, trying to ignore what he was saying, but curiosity and fear were eating away at me. He knew things even those close to me didn't. Small but intimate details, like how I always leave the hallway light on at home because the dark makes me uneasy, or how, when I'm nervous, I tend to crack my knuckles, something I was doing at that moment without realizing it. The more he spoke, the more I felt like I was being stripped of all my defenses, as if he were rifling through my soul without permission. Then something even stranger happened. The road began to change. The snow, which had been falling gently before, started piling up in tall mounds, blocking parts of the path that had seemed clear earlier. The GPS in my car, which had been working fine, began spinning as if it were lost. My heart was racing. I tried to stay calm and almost unintentionally asked where he wanted to get off, but he just laughed, a low, almost mocking sound. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he said, still not looking directly at me. The phrase made my stomach churn. I was sure I had never driven down that road before. It was impossible. I lived hours away, and this trip was taking me along a completely new route. But something in his tone made me doubt. I tried to answer firmly, "No, I've never been here," but my voice came out shaky. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling smile, as if he knew my answer was a lie, even though I was certain it was the truth. Then I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. My own tire tracks in the snow were disappearing. With each passing second, it was as if the road behind us was being erased. Desperate, I started to feel trapped, like there was no way out of this situation. My hands were so sweaty they slipped on the steering wheel. I told myself I needed to stay focused on driving, but my vision was growing blurrier. I glanced at the man out of the corner of my eye and noticed he was watching me. Not directly, but as if he were observing something deeper, beyond me. Like he was seeing parts of me even I didn't know existed. My chest felt tight, and instinctively I reached for the dashboard to turn on the radio, hoping to break the suffocating silence. But the radio only emitted static, a sound that seemed to echo in my head, growing louder and louder. The static seemed to blend with the sound of the wind outside, creating an almost unbearable hum. I turned off the radio abruptly, trying to focus on the road. That's when I noticed something completely impossible. We were passing the same stretch of road again. The fallen tree I had driven around about 10 minutes earlier was there again, in the exact same spot. My heart pounded, and I let out a nervous sigh. I looked at the man, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he just stared at me with that same enigmatic smile, as if he was enjoying my despair. "Do you believe in destiny?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence in a way that made me shiver. I didn't answer. I was trying to make sense of what was happening, but my mind couldn't keep up. He continued, "Sometimes the road takes us exactly where we need to be." There was something deeply wrong in the way he said it, as if it wasn't just a vague statement, but a veiled threat. My breathing grew heavier, and I blinked a few times, trying to clear my vision. Then out of nowhere, the man leaned forward and pointed toward the horizon. "There, that's where you need to stop." I followed his finger, trying to see what he was pointing at. In the middle of the white darkness of the snow, a structure stood out in the distance. It looked like an old cabin, partially covered in snow, with broken windows. It didn't make sense for it to be there in the middle of nowhere. It was as if it had materialized out of thin air. "I'm not stopping there," I said, my voice sounding firmer than I expected, but inside I was utterly terrified. He just let out a low chuckle, almost as if he had been expecting that response. "You don't have a choice," he replied, leaning back in his seat again, completely calm. At that moment, the temperature inside the car seemed to have dropped even further. The cold was biting, even though the engine was still running. Something was wrong, not just with the place, but with me too. My hands trembled on the wheel, and my fingers felt numb. I tried to accelerate, to drive past the cabin, but the snow had become so thick that the car started to skid. It was as if the road was forcing me to stop. I had no choice but to stop the car. The snow was too dense, and the tires spun uselessly, kicking up ice in every direction. My heart pounded as I stared at the cabin through the window. It was old, its dark wood rotting, and parts of the roof caved in under the weight of the snow. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but its presence there in the middle of nowhere was unnerving. The man beside me glanced at me with a strange smile, as though he knew exactly what I was thinking. "We need to get out of the car. It's too cold to stay here," he said, but his voice sounded more like a command than a suggestion. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me not to leave. But when I looked at the dashboard and saw that the engine was on the verge of stalling, I realized he was right. The car wouldn't last much longer in this absurd cold. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, trying to ignore the crushing discomfort growing inside me. He stepped out right behind me, his footsteps making dull sounds in the snow. I was never one to believe in scary stories, but what happened that night made me question everything. I was driving down the road when the snowstorm started to intensify. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. And not knowing how long it would last, I decided to look for shelter. That's when I saw it. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, isolated. I thought it would be better than risking an accident by continuing to drive. It seemed too peaceful to be true, but I was exhausted and desperate for warmth. I stepped inside the cabin and was immediately greeted by a man. He looked ordinary, wearing a thick, furry brown coat, and had a calm expression, but something about him unsettled me. I couldn't quite place it, but the way he looked at me as I entered felt off. He didn't speak at first, just watched as I settled near the fireplace, trying to warm my frozen hands. The snow was falling heavily outside, the wind battering the windows, drowning out every other sound. But soon, I realized that the man wasn't paying attention to the storm anymore. He was watching me, constantly, as if he knew exactly who I was and why I was there. I tried to ignore his gaze, but I couldn't. Every move I made seemed to catch his full attention. He didn't speak much, only giving short responses to my questions. But the more he spoke, the more I felt something was wrong. It was as if he had a purpose for being there, a strange feeling that he wasn't just watching me by chance. Each time our eyes met, I felt a growing weight, a sense that something bad was about to happen. My discomfort grew, and my urge to leave intensified, but the storm outside left me with no choice but to stay. As time passed, I became more on edge. The man didn't do anything outright threatening, but his constant presence was unsettling. Every time I looked out the window or tried to distract myself, it felt like he was nearby, watching, waiting. He wasn't doing anything overtly wrong, but the way he watched me made me question his intentions. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the storm showed no sign of letting up. Deep down, something told me I shouldn't wait until morning. Yet somehow, I felt trapped in that place, at the mercy of a stranger I couldn't trust. The storm outside grew fiercer, and the idea of leaving became more absurd. I had no choice but to stay, though something inside me screamed that I should have left earlier. The man began to move around the house more, always silent, which only heightened my unease. Occasionally he would glance at me, but he never spoke much. I started to wonder if he was waiting for me to make a wrong move or simply biding his time for the right opportunity. The constant feeling of being watched was unbearable, and with every step he took, I felt like something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, the hallway light flickered, and I heard a noise from somewhere inside the cabin. The man who had been sitting in the room with me stood up abruptly and walked toward the sound. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, unsure of what to do. The feeling of being completely vulnerable in that place was overwhelming. When he returned, he was holding something in his hands, but I couldn't see what it was. He sat back down in his chair, watching me as though nothing had happened. I stayed there, tense, wondering if he already had a plan to harm me or if it was only a matter of time before he made his move. The silence was deafening, and my heart pounded harder with each passing second. I tried to stay calm, but my mind couldn't stop imagining the worst. The man sat there for several minutes, quietly holding that object, but he still didn't make any move toward me. He just watched, as if waiting for something. When he finally raised his hand, I froze. What had once looked like a shadowy object was now clear. It was a knife, large and sharp, reflecting the dim light of the room. Fear consumed me like a tidal wave. I didn't know what he wanted, but his intentions were far from good. He didn't say a word, but the fact that he sat there with a knife in his hand made me feel like I was trapped with no way out. The tension in the air was suffocating. I glanced toward the window, desperately searching for an escape, but the storm outside was raging, and I knew I couldn't make it far in the wind and snow. All I had was that cabin, and the man with the knife, watching me intently. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but reality was harsh. There was nowhere to run. The man didn't seem to be in a hurry. He just kept watching me, knife in hand, as if he was studying me, waiting for the right moment to act. My stomach churned at the thought that he might already have a plan, that I was the centerpiece of whatever he intended to do. The sense of helplessness was paralyzing. All I wanted was for the storm to end or for someone to show up and save me. I took a deep breath and looked toward the door. The blade gleamed brighter as the man took a step closer, as though testing my reaction. I didn't know what he wanted, but my body was already moving on instinct. I needed a chance to run, or at least distract him long enough to try something. The problem was that the storm outside felt even more hostile than he did, and the sense of being trapped in that cabin with an armed stranger left me completely desperate. I knew my only option was to act quickly if I had any chance at all. That's when my eyes fell on something on the floor near my chair. It was a small wooden beam, perhaps part of a broken piece of furniture or construction debris from the cabin. Without thinking, I bent down and grabbed it. The wood felt solid, and despite my panic, I knew I didn't have much time. The man was still there, knife in hand, as if waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My only chance was to move fast. With the beam gripped tightly in my hand, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. He took another step toward me, each step bringing him closer. Suddenly, with all the strength I could muster, I swung the beam and hurled it toward his head. The impact was immediate. He didn't even have time to react, and the sound of the wood striking his forehead was brutal. He staggered backward, shocked and disoriented, the knife falling from his hands. Seizing the moment of weakness, I bolted for the door. The fierce wind from the storm greeted me with full force, but I knew the road was out there, even if it was buried under snow and gusts. The sheer relief of having a chance to escape gave me strength, and I didn't look back, knowing this was my only opportunity to get away, no matter how hostile the weather outside. The snow might slow me down, but it was nothing compared to the man who had just tried to kill me. I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the biting cold and the exhaustion clawing at me. The cabin was already a distant silhouette when I reached my car, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I had no idea if the man was following me, but I didn't dare take the chance to check. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The snow was thick on the road, but the sense of finally being on the move gave me a flicker of hope. The wind howled relentlessly and visibility was nearly non-existent, but I couldn't stop. The man could still be out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity to get me. The car rocked unsteadily as it navigated the narrow, snow-covered roads, but stopping was a greater risk than continuing. Every inch of me was tense, my chest tight with dread, but I couldn't slow down. The silence inside the car was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine struggling against the snow. My eyes darted to the rear-view mirror every few seconds, even though I knew he couldn't have followed me that quickly. Still, what if he was hiding somewhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Every shadow along the road seemed to shift and move, as if something or someone was there, watching me. Even the storm raging outside felt like an extension of the terror consuming me. But I was getting closer to home, closer to safety. I had to believe I could escape this nightmare. I know this might sound like just another horror story, but I swear what happened to me and my girlfriend that weekend has never left my mind. It all started with a simple idea to spend a weekend in an isolated retreat. I wanted something romantic, away from the city, just the two of us, a fireplace, and the promise of some peaceful nights. We booked a remote cabin in the mountains. The place looked perfect in the photos. Rustic wood, a stunning view of the forest, and no one around. Perfect for relaxing. But from the very first day, things started to get strange. I felt like I was being watched as soon as we arrived. At first, I thought it was just in my head. After all, who wouldn't feel uneasy in such a remote place? But as the day went on, I began to sense a presence I couldn't pinpoint. While we walked around the cabin, there was always something in the shadows of the forest, always trailing us from a distance. Sometimes I thought I saw movement among the trees, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. My girlfriend noticed it too, but she tried to mask her fear, suggesting it was just the wind or an animal, but I knew it wasn't. As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier. The cabin, which had seemed like a cozy retreat, now felt oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside, watching my every move. It was around 9 p.m. when we decided to light the fireplace, and as the flames illuminated the room, I noticed the shadows on the walls didn't move as they should. They were thicker, more alive, shifting slowly like they were lurking. I tried convincing myself it was just the light playing tricks, but I couldn't ignore how tense my girlfriend looked, how quiet she had become. When we stepped outside to check around the cabin before bed, something strange happened. As we turned the corner of the cabin, my girlfriend froze. She stood paralyzed, staring into the forest. I followed her gaze, and for a moment saw a hooded figure standing completely still in the darkness. The shadow was far away, but its silhouette was unmistakable. I tried to call out to my girlfriend, but no sound came out. She seemed hypnotized. When I finally managed to call her name, the figure vanished as if it had never been there. We stood in silence, utterly terrified. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but nothing made sense. At first I thought I was just being paranoid, but as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time we moved through the house, I felt like someone else was there, somewhere watching us. I glanced at my girlfriend and saw the same fear in her eyes, the same nervous glances over her shoulder as if expecting something to appear at any moment. We tried to ignore it, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was becoming unbearable. It felt like the walls were closing in and the air grew heavier and colder, as if even the fireplace couldn't provide warmth. At one point, we heard a noise from upstairs. It sounded like someone walking, light and cautious steps. We both went silent, waiting, but the sound stopped as soon as we started up the stairs. I couldn't believe what was happening, but the feeling that we weren't alone was overwhelming. We decided to investigate, climbing the stairs one step at a time, terrified of what we might find. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of our footsteps. When we reached the upstairs hallway, everything was in perfect order, but I could still feel, with chilling clarity, that someone was there, watching us from the darkness. The sensation of being watched never left. I found myself scanning every corner, every shadow, trying to find some explanation. The house felt stranger with every passing hour. The wind outside howled, battering the windows as if trying to break in, and the sound of the swaying trees gave the impression that something was there, hiding in the shadows. My girlfriend was visibly uncomfortable, and the tension between us grew. I tried to keep her calm, but deep down, I was just as scared. The feeling that someone or something was with us was undeniable. We decided to go back downstairs and secure all the windows, locking everything we could. That's when, as we passed the kitchen door, I saw something that froze me to the core. Reflected in the kitchen window was a dark figure, indistinct in shape but moving slowly as if watching us. I froze for a moment, unable to believe what I was seeing. I looked at my girlfriend, who had also seen it, her eyes wide with fear. Without a word, she ran to the opposite side of the house. I followed her, but I knew something was wrong. That figure wasn't just an illusion. It wasn't the wind or the shadow of a branch. It was something far more sinister. The sound of knocking at the door made me freeze. It wasn't normal knocking, but heavy and insistent, as if someone was pounding with force, desperate to get in. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a reflection of our tension, but the knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if it was coming from within the house itself. I looked at my girlfriend, and she was trembling, her eyes fixed on the door. I knew better than to open it. We couldn't answer that, couldn't risk it. We had no idea who or what was out there. But the knocking persisted, faster and more violent with each second. I backed away from the door, and she pressed herself closer behind me as if seeking protection. We tried to ignore it, staying as far from the door as possible, but the feeling that someone was just outside watching us wouldn't leave. The house felt alive, breathing with us. Every shadow, every creak seemed heavier, more deliberate. The fear in the air was so thick it felt like it was suffocating us. At one point, the knocking stopped and a heavy silence fell over the cabin. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. The silence was broken by a whisper, a faint murmur so low it was almost inaudible. But the realization that it was coming from inside the house made it clear. Something was watching us, and we weren't welcome there. I tried to act rationally. I looked out the window but saw nothing. The place was deserted, and the snow covering everything seemed untouched. Even so, the feeling that someone was out there didn't go away. The murmuring, now clearer, seemed to come from a corner of the room where one of the shadows looked denser, heavier than the others. I approached it slowly, trying not to make a sound. My girlfriend, pale and panic-stricken, followed without saying a word, as if just as paralyzed with fear as I was. She held my hand so tightly I could feel her fingers digging in, almost as if she were trying to cling to me to avoid being lost somewhere. As I got closer to the shadow, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The basement door was slightly ajar, which was impossible since we had locked all the doors before going upstairs. I knew no one had been down there, but the sight of that door half open, as if inviting someone to step through, sent chills down my spine. The sound returned. Louder now, stronger, as if something or someone was moving through the house. The idea that this was just our imagination was fading quickly. I could feel something approaching, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind spiraling in that sinister place. But when the knocking on the door returned, this time much louder, like someone trying to break it down, I had no more doubts. This wasn't imagination. Something was there with us. I took a deep breath, trying to summon some courage. What else could I do? I yelled from inside, asking who was at the door, but the only response was silence. Nothing but the sound of snow hitting the windows and the whisper of the wind, which now felt more like a distant voice echoing from some nameless place. The fear grew. The sensation of being watched intensified with every second, like someone was behind every wall, lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. But no one answered. The knocking stopped and silence enveloped the room. I wasn't sure if that was better or if the constant threat of something happening out there was even more terrifying. I looked at my girlfriend, who was nearly in shock, clutching a pillow and staring at the door. I knew she wanted to leave, just like I did, but we couldn't. The snowstorm was growing stronger, and the road was completely covered. I looked out the window and saw nothing but a relentless white wall of falling snow. The wind howled, shaking the trees, and the house groaned as if it were about to collapse. I knew venturing out into the storm would be impossible, so I made a decision. I told my girlfriend we would stay until sunrise and leave as soon as the storm passed. Waiting for daylight seemed like the safest choice. The tension in the room was suffocating, but the thought of facing the storm and risking something even worse out there was unbearable. So we stayed, waiting for the night to pass, the silence around us like a freezing shroud. When the sun finally began to rise, the shadows in the room gave way to the soft light of morning. But the sense of relief I had imagined didn't come. What happened the night before was still too vivid in my mind. I looked at my girlfriend, who was still lying there, pale and silent. When she finally stirred, her eyes were filled with a fear I couldn't fully understand. I tried to talk to her, to figure out what she was feeling, but she simply looked at me and shook her head as if wanting to forget. I wanted to leave quickly, but at the same time something told me this wasn't over. Something was wrong, and I couldn't pinpoint what. I wasn't sure I wanted to. We left the house, and the snow seemed gentler, as if the storm had left behind a blanket of calm. The road was practically deserted, with no other soul in sight. I was eager to leave, but something kept gnawing at me, something I couldn't understand. It didn't take long for me to notice that the cabin door was slightly open. There were no signs of anyone left inside. But for a moment, as I stared at the open door, a strange sensation came over me. It was as if the air around me had thickened, as if something was waiting for me to step back inside, something I would rather not face. I looked at my girlfriend, and she noticed it too. Without a word, we just got into the car and drove off. The silence in the car was heavy, like the very space around us was watching, waiting, and I never found out what really happened that night. All I know is that to this day I can't shake the feeling of being watched.